Breakout Shot, Part 1. Billy the Pool Hustler. He slept on a bench in the back of the pool hall, with his head resting on his cue case, and the pre-dawn traffic lulling him to sleep, and with the first rack break of the morning he went out to the street and smoked as the light began to glow behind the edges of the buildings. Then he went, cigarette in his mouth, trailing smoke back through the pool hall and into the kitchen, where a group of gamblers leaned and stood and paced and smoked around a small television with the volume loud, the sound of the crowd like static. He smoked and watched the game over shoulders, and some of the men turned and frowned at him, his presence and interference on their séance. So he went and found some coffee in a pot and poured it into a paper cup and put it in the microwave. Over the sound of the microwave and the game buzzing, the gamblers made a collective groan. He took his coffee and passed back through, and they all looked sullen and tired. He went back into the pool hall and sat down at one of the side tables. He put his cigarette in the ashtray and sipped coffee, ran his fingers through his hair and rubbed his forehead and his temples. He thought about the passing of time, and time passed, and some of the regulars began to file in. He saw Tong and went over, and they began to play pool without much more than a nod, as if resuming an endless session. They played 9-ball through the morning and into the afternoon, when the sun was overhead, heating up the old tar roof, and the heat broke through the coolness of the morning, and everyone was in a dulled haze. Billy moved slowly around the table, and Tong was quiet, only smoking and dabbing his brow and drinking gin over ice and mostly watching. Between games he stood in the path of the fans that were placed around the room, and there was only the sound of the clacking pool balls dropping into pockets and the fans droning all around. "You play so well, Billy, even in the middle of the night, even at the crack of dawn. Are you both a morning and a night person?" "I suppose." "Did you sleep?" "A little, maybe." "Maybe you don't need to sleep much." "Maybe not." Tong pulled another $100 bill from his damp billfold and set it on the rail as Billy began to run through the rack again. Then he poured another glass of gin and lit a cigarette and blew smoke into the hazy dark room, and the smoke curled and hung in the yellow light over the tables. Billy broke again, and the rack was wide open. 5-ball, side pocket. He circled the table and lined up his next shot. 6-ball, corner pocket. He pointed with the cue and shot, stunning down the 6-ball into the pocket with a little spin, like an executioner dropping his axe with a perfect chop, the head rolling down into the basket below. Dead eyes staring up at him. He pointed with the cue. He saw an angle and chipped in the 7-ball. He drilled the 8-ball and did not slow roll the 9, firing it in to win another game. The following break he left congestion around the rack and drew back to a tidy position behind the 9. Tong stood up, serious. He saw the angle and took the shot. He dropped the shot with a little luck, then ran the rest of the rack and collected his money from off the rail. Billy set his cue aside and opened his case on the side table. He disassembled the cue and set it into the case, closed the case, and went out towards the street. "Where the fuck are you going? I win a game and you leave?" "Taking a break. I need some air." "Son of a bitch gets a golden break earlier, and now he needs some air. I need some fucking air." Billy went to the door and opened it and stepped out onto the street. "The sky looks low, Billy," Tong said through the open door, just before it swung closed. Billy looked up at the dense and gray clouds overhead. He walked up and down the street as dusk began to settle on the city. The street lights were not yet on, and so the street lay in a dim cloak as the air began to cool in the twilight. He walked through the park and around the main streets, past taco stands and pizza parlors and bars and people leaning in doorways and sitting on staircases. He bought a slice of pizza and ate a few bites before throwing it down the alley. Even the rats needed to eat. Then it was getting dark and Billy stood on the edges of the streetlight and smoked and watched the pool hall. It began to rain. He flicked his cigarette into the gutter and crossed the street and walked past the small crowd of smokers gathered out front. Billy entered the pool hall beneath the yellowing sign depicting a man with red shoes that danced in flashing light. The pool hall was crowded now. He moved through the groups hovering among the rows of billiards tables, the sound of pool balls clacking and falling into pockets, and racks breaking all around. He found Tong in the middle of the room, under the yellow table lights, about to take his shot, with a crowd of onlookers surrounding. Tong was skeletal, wearing a baggy button-down shirt with the sleeves rolled up, his arms only thicker than the pool cue he now wielded. 9-ball corner pocket, he said. Tong pointed with the cue and took a moment to line up his shot, then sunk the 9-ball into the corner pocket. He collected his money from off the rail and shook hands with his opponent, a tall man with a ball cap low over his eyes. The two men spoke for a moment and Tong declined another game with a wave of his hand, dancing cigarette smoke through the air. "I need to speak to my friend Billy over here," Tong said. Tong came round the table and shook Billy's hand, grinning. "You have a way with people," Billy said. "Tough opponent. Perhaps we shoot another game, Billy. I have to go. Meeting with a friend over at the green room. Just came back in to say goodbye. That game, it's going to get robbed. Inside job, but they going to blame it on me. Say it was my guys. You didn't hear it from me, though. Thanks for the warning. You leave when it was my rack earlier. You owe me another game," Tong said. "All right, one game." Tong went and racked up and leaned into the table and pulled the rack away, and the pool balls shined in the pale yellow light. They played more than one game, and Billy won most of them. After the last game, Billy took his cue stick apart and put it back into the case and was walking away when Tong yelled after him through the crowd and the tables of kinetic pool balls. "You hear about the new kid in town? I got a new nemesis for you to face, Billy. He's going to finish you for good. I'm going to back him until he ruins you. If this guy can't beat you, I'm going to retire, Billy. You hear what I'm saying? You'll finally be rid of me, Billy. Can't wait for you to meet him. His name is Odin. He's a goddamn god, and he's got your number, Billy." Billy lifted his arm up and gave a wave without looking back and went out the door. He walked west along the wet night pavement with the streetlights reflecting off the puddles and windows. He walked down littered alleyways and under streetlights and past storefront windows now dark. Eventually he stood at a door with a green awning overhead and rang the bell and looked up at the camera. The door buzzed and he went in, and as he climbed up the staircase he could hear over the sound of the rain outside the men talking and chips shuffling in the poker room above. A heavy-set man opened the door at the top of the stairs, and Billy went in, and the room was full of poker players sitting at tables, and there was a man celebrating winning a large pile of chips being pushed to him, while another man held his head in his hands, muttering to the floor. One of the dealers dealt a handout around the table, then another. A waitress smiled at Billy as she passed. She wore a short skirt and heavy makeup and smelled of perfume through the smoke. There was the noise of poker chips shuffling all around. There was yelling from the furthest table, and a man stood up before throwing his cards at the dealer. Keith was at one of the poker tables, and he stood and came over and shook hands with Billy. "Hey, good to see you. Glad you could make it. You should play. Put his name on the list," Keith said. "I need to go home and sleep," said Billy. The action is on you, Keith." Keith looked over, and it was George speaking. George looked back with eyes sharp, his hair slick and dark, as if wet with black blood, pulled tight across his head into a small ponytail. Keith turned back towards the table. "That's all right, deal me out. You don't want to at least see what you've been dealt? What if you've been dealt a pair of aces?" "Nah, I'm good. Suit yourself." There was an eerie quiet in the room while George spoke, and after he was finished everyone laughed. Paulie, with his hat hanging off the back of his head, laughed especially loud, along with a shifty and dark-eyed and lanky gambler that everyone called the Wizard. The dealer dealt the cards out around the table. George folded his hand out of turn and rose from the table and came across the room like a shark through murky water. He put his hand on Billy's shoulder. "I hear you don't want to play in my poker room tonight. What's the deal? The depth of the action tonight requires a deep dive." "I've just been up for 2 days, maybe longer, playing pool with Mr. Tong," said Billy. George hit Billy in the chest with the back of his hand. Then he grabbed Billy's shoulder and squeezed. Perfect constitution for an all-night session. "I need to go home and sleep." "Sleep is the cousin of death," said George. "Yeah, well, I'm going to die if I don't sleep." "The world will have to just keep on going without you, I suppose," said George. George smiled and went down the hallway and into the back office. Billy lowered his voice. "You winning?" Keith looked around the room dramatically, eyebrows raised. "I suspect these bastards are colluding against me. A lot of looking at each other with a sideways eye and laughing in unison. Has a feeling like they're in cahoots." "You should play at the shoe anyway," said Billy. "Games aren't as good," said Keith. "Yeah, well, this game is going to get robbed." "Maybe so. It's a dangerous world. With the risk comes reward. Saw a guy lose his kid's college fund here over the course of the summer, the year before last. I remember the cicadas screaming all day long through the windows while we played in the afternoons. We always played into the night, and I remember one night he told us that he had lost everything and cried. Still had some money in front of him at that point. Must have been the last of it. Never saw him again after that." "Want to smoke?" asked Billy. Keith looked at his wrist, which had no watch. "I'm off the clock." They went through the hallway and down the back staircase to the alley. The pavement and the dumpsters were wet, and there were puddles reflecting the streetlight all around them. "So any interesting hands?" asked Billy. "One where I bluffed Paulie, and Lord did he take forever to fold. I showed him the King-7 of hearts with the board all black cards, and he looked like he wanted to punch through my fucking face. He won the Circuit Main about a month ago, 95K. Billy only imagined he would have that much money in distant dreams, forgotten upon awakening. He could feel the rush and the fear of it. He imagined himself turning it into more and more, and with that the never-ending urge to up the ante and walk a tightrope of endless escalation. A moment away from disaster and the glory only ever fleeting and nothing more. Anyone for any amount, even if he ends the night with nothing, the abyss right beneath him, waiting for him to slip. Keith lit a cigarette and blew the smoke up into the cool night air, and it hovered above them in the dim alley streetlight. "You know Paulie lost all that money in the pit already, though, right?" "You're kidding." "I kid you not. Blackjack." "He lost 95K in a month playing blackjack?" "It was faster than a month. Took the weekend," Keith said. Billy lowered his voice. "Well, he's going to get unlucky again, because he plays here all the time, and this game is going to get robbed. Don't play here for a while." "This is a hunch, or do you know something?" "I'm just telling you to avoid the game for a little while, starting as soon as possible." "What did you hear? Tong?" "I just heard something on the wind. Maybe an inside job. Don't repeat it and get me killed." "The house always wins," said Keith. "Truer words have never been spoken," Billy replied.